Good evening. My friend, before you close your eyes tonight, before sleep wraps its quiet arms around your thoughts, I want you to imagine this Topkapi palace. At dawn, in the year 1623, a marble corridor, a scream, not the sound of war, not the moan of a dying soldier, but the raw, trembling voice of a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of the most powerful ruler on earth. Her cry cut through the stillness like a blade through silk, echoing against the jeweled walls of the Ottoman Empire. And yet, no one came to help her, because what happened that morning was not meant to be seen. It was not an accident, it was tradition. For 600 years, this ritual remained locked behind the golden doors of Istanbul's imperial palace. Historians erased it, poets ignored it, and the empire itself buried it beneath layers of silk and ceremony. Only in recent years, when secret Ottoman documents were uncovered, I did the truth crawl back into the light. A truth so disturbing that even the bravest chroniclers of history hesitated to speak it aloud. Tonight, we will, because every empire has its darkness, and every princess once dreamt of freedom before the night turned into horror. The Ottoman Empire was a world of power without end, stretching from the burning sands of Arabia to the icy mountains of the Balkans. Its armies roared like thunder across 3 continents. Its palaces glittered with mosaics and gold. But within those walls, where perfume hid the scent of fear, lived a secret world, the imperial harem, a place of silken cages, where women were raised to obey, to smile, to never question. Many imagine the harem as a paradise of music and jewels. In truth, it was a labyrinth of silence. And at the heart of that labyrinth were not concubines or slaves, but the Sultan's own daughters, princesses who were born not to rule, but to be sacrificed. Fatma Sultan was one of them. She was the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and Kosum Sultan, the woman who would later become the most powerful queen mother in Ottoman history. Fatma was brilliant. She could read Persian and Arabic poetry before she turned 12. She studied astronomy. She debated scholars with the boldness of a prince. But none of that mattered. From the moment she was born, her life belonged to politics. She was not a girl. She was a treaty waiting to be signed. When Fatma turned 15, her marriage was arranged to Mustafa Pasha, a war-hardened general 20 years older than her. For the empire, it was an alliance. For her, it was the beginning of something much darker. 3 months before her wedding, she was taken into what palace officials called the sacred education. But there was nothing sacred about it. It was a ritual designed to destroy a princess's pride, to turn her into a symbol of submission. For hours each day, she practiced 18 forms of bowing, rehearsed the gestures of obedience, and was forced to learn how to speak using only 43 words of gratitude, apology, and silence. Anything else, any spark of thought or emotion, was punished. By the end of her training, she no longer walked like herself, spoke like herself, or even thought like herself. The princess who once studied the stars had been reshaped into an ornament, polished, wordless, perfect. Then came the night. March 15th, 1623. Istanbul glittered with celebration. The people cheered for the royal wedding. The drums beat. The torches burned bright. But deep inside Topkapi Palace, Fatma sat in stillness, her lips dry, her hands trembling. Her dress shimmered in gold. Her crown pressed heavy on her head. Every step she took had been choreographed, every breath monitored. The palace physicians later wrote that her pulse was weak, her skin cold, her eyes distant as if she were drifting away before the night had even begun. The bridal pavilion, the place of the so-called sacred union, was designed like a fortress of control. Every chamber represented a stage of surrender. The first floor was for purification, where she was bathed in rosewater and oils mixed with crushed poppy and diluted opium, meant to soften her will. The second floor was for submission, where she was dressed in a gown so heavy it pinned her to the ground, with hidden clasps that allowed attendants to restrain her. And the third floor, the chamber of consummation, was where the empire's illusion of purity became an act of terror. The walls were covered with tapestries of conquered cities and kneeling queens, a reminder that even love was a form of conquest. And there, as the doors closed, Princess Fatma faced the night she had been raised to fear. What happened in that room was recorded only in fragments, medical notes, coded diaries, broken lines of confession. They tell us that Fatma collapsed into silence, her body trembling, her mind slipping into a state the doctors called sakma shock, so deep that the soul seemed to leave the body. The ritual ended, but the wound did not. From that night on, the girl who once spoke poetry could barely whisper. She stopped eating. She avoided every man, even the guards. She was no longer a daughter, nor a wife, nor a princess. She was a shadow wearing silk. Years passed. Fatma bore children, attended ceremonies, appeared in portraits, but inside, she was gone. Even her husband, Mustafa Pasha, fled into endless wars and opium, haunted by what he had done, by what the empire demanded. When Fatma died in the year 1652, her death was recorded as a brain fever, but the date was the same as her wedding anniversary. The doctors called it coincidence. The palace called it silence. But those who remembered her knew it was not sickness that took her, it was memory. And Fatma was not alone. The archives whisper of dozens of Ottoman princesses trained the same way, silenced by the same rituals. Some lost their voices, some lost their minds. Others simply vanished, erased from the records, as if they had never existed. The empire perfected the art of erasure, wrapping cruelty in gold and calling it honor. But traces remained in secret letters, in coded diaries, in the faint voices of women who dared to resist. A few of them found ways to escape, to fake their deaths, to whisper forbidden messages to their sisters through embroidered patterns. They were the invisible rebels of the harem, fighting back in the only language they were allowed to use, silence. So tonight, as you listen to her story, remember this: not every crown protects. Some crowns are made of iron beneath the gold. The cry that echoed through the palace of Topkapi 4 centuries ago was not just the cry of one girl, it was the sound of every woman whose pain was rewritten as ceremony. For 600 years, history tried to bury their voices. But the marble still remembers, the walls still echo, and when you close your eyes, perhaps you will hear it too. The faint, trembling breath of a princess who once dreamed of the stars, before the empire turned her dreams into chains. Now, take a breath, because in the next chapter, we will step deeper into the palace where silk hides scars, and mirrors were used as weapons. The story of Fatma Sultan has only just begun. Good evening again, my friend. Before we continue, take a deep breath. The marble corridors are quiet now. The torches have burned down to whispers of smoke, and the music from the royal celebration has faded into the farthest corners of the palace. What remains is the echo of a girl's heartbeat, faint and uncertain, trapped somewhere between life and silence. Tonight, we return to the palace of Topkapi, not as guests at a feast, but as unseen witnesses moving through the shadows where no one dares to speak. This is where the ritual of mirrors begins, and where a young princess slowly forgets the sound of her own voice. In the early days after her wedding, the palace chroniclers wrote of harmony and grace. Fatma Sultan was praised in ceremonies as the perfect wife, the dutiful daughter, the obedient emblem of the dynasty's virtue. But behind the doors of the Galen Pavilion, a different story unfolded. One the empire could not allow to reach its historians. Her attendants reported long hours of stillness. She would sit near the lattice windows where the light fell in narrow slits, tracing patterns on the carpet with her fingers, as if trying to recall a melody she once knew. Her lips would move without sound, shaping forgotten words from a language she was forbidden to speak. It was as if her mind were floating somewhere beyond the walls, searching for the pieces of herself that had been taken away in the name of obedience. The physicians came daily, writing their observations in delicate Arabic script, disguising pain beneath medical poetry. They noted melancholia of divine origin, weakness of the breath, withdrawal from earthly appetites. But what they could not write, what they dared not even think, was that the empire itself had broken her. Each night, attendants placed mirrors around her bed, large Venetian mirrors with silvered backs that caught every flicker of lamplight. The ritual was called muraqabah, once a sacred Sufi practice of self-reflection, meant to purify the soul. Yet in the palace, it had been twisted into a tool of control. The mirrors forced the princess to watch herself constantly, her movements, her expressions, her smallest hesitations, until she could no longer tell which reflection was real. It was said that if a princess could face her image without trembling, the empire would call her cured. Fatma never passed that test. When she looked into the mirror, she saw not a princess, but a stranger, eyes empty, lips parlor, hands trembling like leaves under frost. Day after day, her attendants repeated the ritual. They combed her hair with ivory combs, dipped in scented oils, dressed her in silks that glowed under candlelight, and whispered the same words of submission she had been taught during her sacred education. The phrases were carved into her memory like prayers. Gratitude is obedience. Obedience is peace. Peace is silence. At first, she tried to whisper prayers of her own, words from the Quran she had learned as a child beside her mother, but even prayer became dangerous. Gulnar Khatun, the old mistress of the harem, who had overseen her training, would appear at her door whenever she heard a sound. Her voice was soft, her movements deliberate, but her eyes were cold as marble. Your voice belongs to the empire, she would say, not to yourself. And so Fatma learned to keep her prayers within her breath, like embers hidden beneath ash. Outside her chamber, the empire changed. Her brother, Sultan Murad IV, rose to power, a ruler of iron will and merciless laws. The palace grew darker, filled with whispers of executions, betrayals, and silenced concubines. The laughter of musicians disappeared, replaced by the echo of boots and chains. Yet inside her rooms, time no longer moved. Fatma's world had shrunk to the rhythm of the lamps, the rustle of fabrics, and the sound of her own heart. Sometimes, when night stretched endlessly, she would rise from her bed and walk barefoot across the marble, touching the walls as if they were alive. She would whisper names her father's Greek, her mother's, the names of scholars who had once taught her astronomy, but no one answered. The silence pressed on her like the weight of a mountain. Months turned into years. Her husband, Mustafa Pasha, spent most of his time away on campaigns in Persia and the Balkans. When he returned, he came with gifts, pearls, gold, scrolls of calligraphy, but never with warmth. They spoke little. He had been trained, like her, to play a role written by the empire. He would sit beside her at banquets, raise his cup, and smile for the court. But when the night came, his silence was heavier than hers. Some said he pitied her. Others whispered he feared her, that he saw in her eyes a reflection of his own guilt. Whatever truth lay between them was buried under years of ritual and duty. They shared a bed, but not a life. As Fatma's silence deepened, her attendants began to fear her. They said she could predict storms, that she would wake before dawn and write verses in languages none of them understood, covering the walls with ink before wiping it away in terror. One night, a servant swore she saw the princess speaking to her reflection in the mirror, answering in a voice not her own. The palace physicians dismissed it as hysteria, prescribing tinctures of saffron and poppy. But Kushem Sultan, now the most powerful woman in the empire, heard the rumors and came to see her daughter. It was the first time they had spoken in years. Kosum found Fatma seated before a mirror, her hair unbound, her eyes unfocused. For a moment, the mother hesitated, as if unsure whether to embrace her child or bow before the ghost she had created. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled not with love, but with regret. "You are strong," she whispered, though her eyes betrayed the lie. "You have fulfilled your duty." Fatma did not answer. She lifted her gaze to the mirror where both their faces were reflected, the queen and the broken girl, and in that reflection, they saw the price of power. Neither could escape. After that night, Kusham never returned. The empire moved forward. Wars were fought, cities conquered, sons born and lost. History recorded the victories of men, the decrees of sultans, the splendor of Istanbul, but nowhere did it mention the woman in the quiet room surrounded by mirrors. Fatma's life continued in stillness. Her attendants aged beside her, their faces lined with years of service. Children grew up hearing stories of a princess who lived in eternal twilight, who never raised her voice, who had once loved the stars, but could no longer bear to look at the sky. Yet not all of her vanished completely. Among the archives discovered centuries later, hidden between medical reports and royal letters, historians found fragments written in a woman's hand, thin, trembling lines of Ottoman Turkish that scholars now believe were Fatma's. They were not poems or confessions, but something stranger, a dialogue between herself and her reflection. The girl in the mirror, one line reads, knows what the woman has forgotten. She remembers how the stars moved before the walls were built. Another passage speaks of a secret map drawn on the ceiling of her chamber. Constellations traced in invisible ink, as if she were trying to rebuild the heavens inside her prison. These writings, preserved only by accident, reveal the last spark of the girl. She had once been the child who believed that knowledge could set her free. In her final decade, Fatma ceased to speak altogether. The attendants said she communicated only through gestures, through glances, through the slow rhythm of her hands on silk. Her silence became legend, a form of power the empire could not explain. Some began to fear that she had crossed into the world of saints, that her suffering had turned her holy. Pilgrims whispered prayers outside her windows, hoping her pain might intercede for their sins. Others mocked her as mad. Yet in that madness, there was something unbroken, something that defied the empire's desire to erase her completely. She might have forgotten her voice, but she had not forgotten the truth, and perhaps that was her quiet revenge. When the end came, it was gentle. One winter morning in the year 1652, the attendants entered her room and found her seated by the mirror, her face peaceful, her eyes open as if watching the sunrise that never reached her window. The reflection showed her younger self, smiling faintly, as if the two halves had finally become one again. The physicians called it a fever of the brain, but those who had served her knew better. She had simply stopped fighting the silence. The ritual of mirrors was complete. Tonight, as we close this chapter, let us linger on one thought. Fatma Sultan's voice may have been taken, but her story remains, carried through centuries like a whisper through stone. In every palace that glitters, in every empire that hides its cruelty behind ceremony, there are echoes of that same silence. Echoes of women whose names were erased, but whose pain still vibrates beneath the surface of history. When you listen closely enough, the silence itself begins to speak. So rest now. My friend, let the torches fade. In our next chapter, we will walk beyond the walls of Topkapi to the courtyards where other princesses waited for the same fate, and to the letters that tried to warn them, for even in the empire of silence, there were those who dared to write, and those letters, long hidden in the shadows, are about to be read for the first time in 400 years. Good evening once again, my friend. The lamps are low, and the night outside is heavy with the scent of rain. Tonight, we open a chapter that history almost erased, not a chapter of battles or kings, but of whispers, of paper hidden beneath silk cushions, of messages that trembled in the hands of frightened girls. When the empire silenced its princesses, when it sealed their voices behind the marble of Topkapi Palace, the words found another way to live. They slipped through cracks in the walls, travelled between trembling fingers, and crossed the dark corridors in the form of secret letters. These letters were the last rebellion of women who had been forbidden to speak, and through them, we can still hear the soft, defiant heartbeat of those who tried to run. After the death of Princess Fatma Sultan in the year 1652, the palace did not pause to mourn. In Empidus, grief is only a private luxury. The marble floors were washed, the mirrors polished, the chambers reassigned, yet something changed. Something small but dangerous. The attendants who had once served Fatma carried her memory like a hidden ember. And in the years that followed, they began to pass quiet warnings to the younger girls who were entering the same cycle of ritual and obedience. They did not speak these warnings aloud. Speech could be punished, but they wrote tiny scraps of paper, sometimes no larger than a hand, slipped inside the hems of robes or tucked into the folds of a prayer book. Each one contained a few trembling lines, written in old Ottoman Turkish, in a hand that shook between fear and hope. The first letters that historians have confirmed came from the time of Princess Ayşe Sultan, a niece of Fatma who came of age during the reign of Sultan Mehmed IV. Her mother, one of Kusum Sultan's surviving daughters, feared what awaited her child and tried to protect her. But within the empire, even love was a risk. Ayşe's training began when she was 14. Under the same system of rituals that had destroyed Fatma decades before, the letters that survive from her attendants tell us that the old ways had not changed the sacred education. The bowing, the silence, the endless nights of rehearsal before the mirrors. Yet now, there was something new, a network of quiet women who had learned how to whisper without sound. They called themselves the Sisters of the Veil, and they were not rebels in the way the empire feared. They did not draw swords or plan escapes through the city gates. Their weapon was knowledge small. Forbidden truths passed from one girl to another. They taught each other how to fake fainting to delay the rituals, how to write with invisible ink made from pomegranate juice, how to hide letters behind the embroidered patterns of a gown, and above all, they preserved the memory of Fatma Sultan, turning her tragedy into a warning. Do not forget the girl of mirrors. One letter says, "For she saw what the empire never wants us to see, that silence is not peace. The story of the letters might have ended there, swallowed by time. But in the year 1679, something extraordinary happened. A princess named Mihriban Sultan, another cousin in the royal line, attempted what no daughter of the House of Osman had ever dared. She tried to escape. She was 17 years old, newly betrothed to an aging pasha whose wealth outweighed his cruelty. On the eve of her wedding, she disappeared from her chambers, leaving behind a single folded paper sealed with a strand of her own hair. The message inside contained only 9 words: "I will not live another night in the empire of fear." Her flight lasted only a few hours. She was found near the sea walls of Istanbul, dressed in a servant's cloak, her feet bare, her veil torn by the wind. The guards brought her back to the palace before dawn. She was never executed. Royal blood was too sacred for that. But she was confined to a small pavilion overlooking the Bosphorus, forbidden to speak or see the light of day. For 3 years, she lived in that isolation until her death, officially recorded as fever, though her attendants whispered that she simply stopped breathing one night, as if her soul had walked out through the locked door. Yet her letters survived. When the imperial archives were opened in the early 21st century, researchers found a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Their ink faded, their corners burned. They were Mihriban's writings, letters addressed not to her family, but to the other princesses still inside the harem. One of them reads, "If they teach you to bow, remember the stars. They bend for no one. If they tell you that silence is holy, remember that silence can also be a tomb." Those words, fragile as ash, became a revelation. They proved that within the very heart of obedience, there had always been resistance. After Mihriban's death, the palace tightened its control. The ritual of mirrors grew more elaborate, the surveillance stricter. Guards were assigned even to the sewing rooms, where women once embroidered in quiet companionship. Yet rebellion has a way of surviving in the smallest spaces. In the century that followed, the letters continued, changing form and language. Some were written as poetry, others disguised as religious hymns. A few were hidden inside the bindings of books, waiting for hands brave enough to open them. One such letter, discovered by a scholar in a dusty manuscript of Persian verse, contained a single sentence that scholars believe was written by a later descendant of the dynasty. "The harem is a city where every window opens to the same wall." For many years, these fragments were dismissed as myths, as the imagination of modern historians longing to give voice to the voiceless. But recently, new evidence emerged, a coded notebook belonging to one of the palace eunuchs who served during the late 17th century. In it, he described seeing the princesses trade pieces of fabric embroidered with strange patterns. The eunuch believed they were harmless ornaments, but his descriptions reveal that each design corresponded to a letter of the alphabet. The princesses had invented a secret embroidery code, a language stitched into silk. Through it, they shared prayers, jokes, warnings, even dreams. One message deciphered from a surviving piece reads, "One day the walls will remember our names." Imagine, my friend, what courage it took to write those words. In a world where every breath was measured, every glance observed, to leave behind a sentence was to risk everything, and yet they did. They wrote not because they believed they would be saved, but because they wanted to be remembered. The empire could erase their bodies, but not their ink. As the years turned into centuries, the letters spread beyond the palace. Some were smuggled out by foreign ambassadors' wives. Others found their way into the hands of Sufi scholars who preserved them as mystical writings. A few even reached Europe, where travelers spoke of the silent women of the East who wrote verses of sorrow behind veils of gold. Western painters romanticized them. Poets turned their suffering into tales of beauty. But the truth remained raw and unembellished. These were not stories of exotic love or mystery. They were records of survival, written by women who had no other voice. When you read those words today, you can almost feel the tremor of the hand that wrote them, the ink slightly uneven, the lines hurried, the pauses between sentences filled with fear, and yet, through that trembling, there is a strength that feels almost sacred. These women, bound by rules older than their own names, still found a way to reach across time and whisper to us. They remind us that silence is never empty. It holds the weight of all the words that were never allowed to be spoken. In the quiet rhythm of their defiance, something began to change. Slowly, almost invisibly, the empire that had thrived on control began to fracture under its own contradictions. The daughters who had once been traded like coins grew into women whose grief could no longer be contained by walls. Their letters spread like cracks through marble, invisible at first, but inevitable. Each generation inherited not only the rituals of submission, but also the memory of resistance. The empire never knew it, but its downfall had already begun, in those whispered lines written by trembling hands. Now, as the night deepens, and you listen to their story, to imagine those letters drifting through the corridors like ghostly moths, brushing against the silk curtains, settling on the cold stone floors. They are the softest rebellion in history, the kind that leaves no blood, no fire, only truth. And when the torches of Topkapi Palace finally dimmed, when centuries later the empire itself dissolved into dust, those letters remained. They outlived the sultans, the viziers, the armies, even the marble walls, because words, once written with the full weight of a soul, never truly die. They linger, waiting for someone like you to listen. So, before you close your eyes tonight, think of the girls who dared to write. Think of their trembling hands, their hidden smiles, their quiet courage. The story of the Ottoman princesses is not only a story of pain, it is also a story of endurance, of women who, even in chains, managed to reach out through time and touch the edge of freedom. Sleep now, and let their whispers follow you. For in the next chapter, we will step beyond the letters and into the secret chambers where those who disobeyed were sent the places the empire erased from its maps. The rooms where the air itself was forbidden to move. Good evening again, my friend. The night has grown softer now, and the air seems to hold its breath, as though the world itself knows that what we are about to uncover was never meant to be heard. Tonight, we step deeper into the palace, past the jeweled corridors and perfumed courtyards, to a place the empire tried to erase from every record, a place known only in whispers, passed from servant to servant, and from mother to daughter, the rooms of silence, the chambers of those who disobeyed, the walls that listened, and the air that remembered every tear. These were not dungeons, not in the way we imagine chains and darkness. They were worse. They were beautiful. That was the cruelty beauty that hid despair. Inside Topkapi Palace, beyond the official harem quarters, there stood a wing known as the House of Contemplation. To outsiders, it was described as a retreat for noble women who sought spiritual reflection or healing. But to those who lived within its walls, it was something far colder, a place where unwanted voices were sent to fade away. The door bore no inscription, and yet everyone in the palace knew what it meant when a girl was sent there. It meant her spirit had cracked in a way that embarrassed the empire. It meant she had spoken when she should have bowed, written when she should have prayed, or simply refused to stop remembering who she was. The walls of that house were carved with marble so polished that they reflected light like mirrors. but the windows were narrow slits high above the floor, allowing sunlight only in broken fragments. The rooms smelled faintly of rose oil and incense, but underneath lingered the unmistakable scent of medicine and salt from tears that had dried over the years. Servants spoke of hearing faint murmurs even when the chambers were empty, as though the walls themselves had learned to speak in the voices of the women who once lived there. At night, when the wind from the Bosphorus crept through the narrow windows, the sound of it was said to resemble weeping. Most of the princesses sent there had not committed crimes. Their only sin was remembering their own minds. Some had refused marriages arranged by the court. Others had been caught writing letters or visiting scholars disguised as physicians. The empire called it corrective isolation. But what it truly was, a slow erasure of identity, a transformation from living woman to obedient echo. The attendants were instructed to call them by titles only, never by their names. They became the silent one, the devout one, the recovered one. Their true selves were left behind, outside the door, like shoes no longer needed for walking. Among the earliest records of this house, one name appears repeatedly: Princess Zahida Sultan, the daughter of Murad IV. She was known for her curiosity, her questions, and her refusal to recite the ritual of obedience without understanding it. When she was 16, she asked one question, too many during a lesson in court etiquette. If my obedience is sacred, why is my silence necessary? The room froze. Her tutors dismissed the question as insolence. But within a week, she was moved to the House of Contemplation for spiritual correction. The letters that survived from her attendants describe her as calm, polite, and endlessly patient. But her silence carried a strange kind of authority. She refused food for 7 days, until the attendants, terrified she might die, allowed her books back. They expected her to read the holy texts, but she chose astronomy instead, the forbidden science of her great-aunt Fatma. They said she spent her nights tracing constellations on the marble walls with candle soot, whispering their ancient names in Greek and Arabic. One attendant wrote in her diary, "When she speaks to the stars, I feel that they listen." Another recorded that during storms, Zahide would sit by the window and sing softly in a voice that seemed to come from another time. None of her songs were written down, but their melodies survived as wordless lullabies among the palace servants for generations. Even a century later, old women in Istanbul hummed those tunes to their children, never knowing they had been born in a room of silence. The empire tolerated her existence for 5 years. Then, in the year 1649, during a period of unrest, an order came from the Sultan himself. Her confinement was to end, one way or another. The next morning, attendants found her lying beside her drawings of stars, her eyes open toward the thin slit of light. The doctors wrote pneumonia. The walls wrote something else. In candlelight, faint markings were discovered along the lower edge of her room, carved by hand into the marble. They were words written backward, so they could only be read in reflection. When scholars later deciphered them, they formed a single sentence: "I am still here." After Zahide's death, fear gripped the palace. The house was sealed for a year, but nothing stays hidden forever. In a place built on secrets, within decades, new names appeared, new daughters, new brides who spoke too loudly or thought too deeply. Some were the sisters of sultans, others the cousins of grand viziers. They all vanished into the same quiet corridor, and every few years, new servants were assigned to tend to their needs, bring water, light lamps, change linens, but never to speak to them directly. Yet silence has a way of creating its own language. A glance, a breath, A movement of the hand could carry entire conversations. There is one surviving account from an attendant named Esma Hatun, who served there for nearly 20 years. Her secret journal, discovered in the early 1900s, describes what it was like inside those rooms. She writes, "The women do not scream. They do not curse. They do not ask for mercy. They only look at you as if you are a mirror, and in their eyes, you see everything you wish you could forget." She tells of one woman who wept not from fear but from laughter, laughter that came without sound, shaking her whole body. She said she was laughing because she could still remember the smell of her father's garden, and that memory was enough to make the empire powerless. Over time, Esma learned that the greatest rebellion was not noise, but endurance. They wait, she wrote, not for freedom, but for someone to remember that they were real. She ended her journal with a haunting thought. The empire believes these rooms erase them, but the walls are thieves. They steal the sound of every word and hide it in their stone. One day, when all of us are dust, the palace will speak again. That prophecy, my friend, turned out to be true. When modern restorers entered the abandoned wing of Topkapi in the early 21st century, they discovered faint resonances in the marble walls, traces of frequencies that seemed to mimic human speech. Scientists called it acoustic mirage, but the workers called it something else. They said the walls were finally telling their stories. They heard patterns that resembled sighs, the rhythm of breathing, even fragments that matched words from old Ottoman poetry. Of course, no one could prove it. Yet those who spent long nights restoring the walls swore they often felt watched not with malice, but with longing, as if the palace itself were tired of being silent. When you think about it, perhaps the empire never truly fell. It only changed its form, shifting from crowns and swords to memory and echoes. Each empire leaves behind ghosts, not of people, but of emotions, grief, guilt, love, fear, all trapped inside the spaces it once ruled. The House of Contemplation is one of those spaces. To stand there, even now, is to feel a presence that no historian can explain. Some say the air grows colder near the walls that once held the princesses. Others claim to have heard faint weeping when the wind moves through the corridor at dusk. And a few those who listen without fear say they have heard laughter, soft, almost playful, like the kind a young girl might make when she sees the stars again, after a long, dark night. So when we speak of history, let us remember that it is not only written in books, it is written in stone, in dust, in the quiet heartbeat of rooms that were never meant to exist. The empire thought it could silence its daughters by enclosing them in marble. But the truth is, marble remembers. The empire forgot their names, but the air still carries their sighs. The empire buried their words, but the walls, oh, the walls kept every one of them. As the night deepens, and the flicker of your lamp begins to fade, to imagine walking through those corridors now, the air cool against your skin, the sound of your footsteps swallowed by history. You would not see them, but you would feel them, an invisible gathering of women whose stories were never told, whose pain was never recorded, yet who somehow survived through the centuries by clinging to the smallest, most human hope of all, that someone, someday, would listen. And tonight, you are that listener. You are the witness they waited for. Now close your eyes for a moment and let the sound of the sea outside the palace reach you. In the next chapter, we will leave the marble halls behind and follow the wind across the Bosphorus to the gardens where forbidden love once bloomed in secret, and where the price of tenderness was paid with exile, because even in a world of silence, the heart still dares to love. Good evening again. My friend, the hour is late, and the world outside seems to be holding its breath. The moon hangs over Istanbul like a silver coin, and the Bosphorus below shivers with ripples of pale light. Tonight, we leave the echoing corridors of Topkapi Palace and step into a quieter, more dangerous place, the Forbidden Gardens. There, behind latticed gates and perfumed walls, something unthinkable once dared to happen. A love was born. A love that could not speak its name, could not write its letters, could not even breathe too loudly in the stillness of night. Yet, for a time, it lived. And that small, secret bloom changed everything. It began in the spring of the year 1673, when the empire was at the height of its power. Istanbul glittered under the rule of Sultan Mehmed IV, whose reign was marked by grand wars and lavish ceremonies. Within the palace walls, the harem expanded into a city of its own. Hundreds of women, servants, scholars, eunuchs, all woven into a web of hierarchy and silence. The princess at the center of this chapter was Aliya Sultan, a descendant of Kusem and niece to the late Fatma Sultan. She was said to possess the same intelligence and quiet fire that had once glowed in Fatma's eyes. But unlike her ancestor, Aliya had grown up in a different world, one that whispered both danger and possibility. The lessons of the empire had become smoother, more subtle. The rituals of obedience were still there, but they now wore the mask of elegance. Aliya's mornings began in the garden of cypress and roses, a secluded courtyard reserved for royal women. It was said that the Sultan's architects designed the garden as a place of peace. But in truth, it was a cage of petals. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and orange blossom, and a small marble fountain whispered constantly in the center. It was here that Aliya first saw him, the man who would alter the rhythm of her fate. His name was Kemal Bey, a young calligrapher brought from Damascus to restore the manuscripts in the palace library. He was not of royal blood, but his artistry had earned him rare access to the private quarters of the Sultan's daughters. His hands moved with the grace of a poet, tracing ink so fine that even the whispers of the Quran seemed to bend around his pen. Aliya watched him from behind a lattice screen as he worked, his eyes calm, his posture humble. She did not yet know that her heart was already learning his name in silence. In the harem, affection was forbidden. Love, if it existed at all, had to hide behind metaphors of poetry and the illusions of ritual. But Aliya had inherited her great-aunt's hunger for understanding and her refusal to remain only a symbol. She began to find excuses to pass through the library under the pretext of study, of prayer, of donation. Each visit lasted only minutes. She would ask questions about the verses he copied, what the curves meant, why certain words seemed to breathe differently when written in gold. And each time he answered, his tone carried something that defied the walls around them. Respect, yes, but also recognition, the kind that says, I see you, even if the world does not allow it. The first act of rebellion between them was not touch, nor even a word of affection. It was ink. One afternoon, Aliya asked to see the calligrapher's practice sheets. He handed her a parchment filled with verses about patience and faith. But in the margins, faint as breath, she saw a single phrase written sideways in Arabic script. The rose does not ask permission to bloom. Her heart tightened. She said nothing. But that night, she returned to her chamber and wrote her reply inside a poem. She was translating, hiding it in the folds of meaning where no one could see. The message was simple. The wind cannot stop the scent. Thus began a language of hidden ink and glances. They never exchanged letters directly. The parchment would pass through many hands, scribes, eunuchs, attendants, none of whom understood the significance of a misplaced dot, a shift in the script, a stroke drawn longer than needed. Each curve was a confession, each accent a sigh. Their entire romance existed between the lines of sacred words, their love written in a language of devotion no empire could punish. But the walls of Topkapi had ears, and the empire, though vast, was a jealous guardian. Rumors began as faint as candle smoke. The chief eunuch noticed the princess visiting the library too often. A servant found an unfinished poem that did not sound like prayer. The head of the harem, suspicious of the new calligrapher, arranged to have his quarters searched. Nothing was found, only scrolls and inks. Papers filled with verses about divine beauty and patience. Yet the tension hung in the air, a storm gathering above the quiet fountain in the garden. One evening, as twilight settled over the Bosphorus, Alia slipped out of her chamber, her veil drawn low. She carried a small manuscript, bound in soft leather, containing her own translations of Persian love poetry. She had written one line in her own hand, a confession so delicate that it might have disappeared if one breathed too closely. Even silence is a conversation when two hearts understand it. She placed the book upon the calligrapher's desk before he arrived and left without looking back. But fate, cruel and curious, had other plans. That very night, the Grand Vizier himself visited the library unannounced, searching for a rare manuscript. The book was discovered before Kemal ever touched it. The handwriting was recognized. By dawn, the entire palace was awake. The calligrapher was summoned, questioned, and dismissed from service under the pretext of impropriety of conduct. The princess was confined to her chambers for reflection. No one spoke the word love, but it hung in every silence. Alia's mother begged the sultan for mercy, arguing that her daughter was merely young and foolish. Yet mercy was not part of the empire's vocabulary. Within a week, Kemal Bey had vanished from Istanbul, sent to a distant monastery in the mountains of Anatolia to copy holy texts until his soul was purified. Some said he was later executed in secret. Others claimed he lived quietly, painting verses upon river stones until his death. The truth, like all forbidden stories, dissolved into rumor. As for Alia, the walls became her witnesses. Her punishment was not imprisonment or death, it was solitude. For years, she lived inside the Pavilion of Spring, a small building overlooking the sea. The empire called it a privilege, she called it her exile. She was allowed to walk in the gardens but never to cross the gates. Allowed to write poetry, but never to address it to anyone. Her words became her companions. Her ink, her only freedom. She filled hundreds of pages with reflections on stars, on fate, on the illusion of control. In one of her surviving poems, found centuries later, she wrote, "I have learned that love is not a rebellion. It is the last proof that I am still alive." Time moved like water, soft but relentless. Season passed. Wars rose and fell. Emperors came and went. And yet within her small world, Alia remained unchanged. Her beauty faded. Her hands grew thin. But her spirit endured. Those who served her said she would often sit by the fountain at dusk, watching the reflection of the moon on the surface, whispering something under her breath. They believed she was reciting prayers. But perhaps she was speaking to the one she loved, somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the empire's reach. When she died at the age of 52, the attendants found her at her desk, surrounded by papers. Among them lay a final verse written in the calligrapher's style. The ink was old, faded, perhaps carried across the years, from one loyal hand to another. No one knows how it reached her. But the words were unmistakable. The rose did not ask permission to bloom, and so the wind carried its scent across the world. On the back, in Alia's handwriting, were 5 words that ended her story. "And I am the wind, That line became legend among the palace servants, whispered like a spell against fear. Even after the fall of the empire, long after the harem dissolved into history, travelers said that on certain spring nights, when the roses bloom near the old palace walls, the air carries a scent stronger than any perfume. Locals call it the wind of Alia. They say it comes without warning, soft as breath, and that if you listen carefully, you can hear faint words hidden within it, something like a sigh, or perhaps a promise. And so, my friend, in a world built on silence and obedience, one woman found a way to make love eternal, not through rebellion, not through defiance, but through the quiet endurance of her own heart. Her story reminds us that the empire could command bodies, but never the spirit. It could ban words, but not meaning. It could forbid love, but not the longing that makes us human. Now let the sound of the fountain fade, and the scent of the roses follow you into your dreams. In our next chapter, we will journey to the heart of power itself, to the throne room, where mothers and daughters played the deadliest game of all, where love turned into weapon, and the crown became the sharpest blade. Good evening once again, my friend. Tonight, as the sea hums softly against the stone walls of the old city, and the lanterns flicker along the Bosphorus, we return not to the gardens of love, but to the heart of power itself. For behind every empire that shines, there is a woman who learns how to rule without a crown, and how to kill without a sword. In the Ottoman palace, that woman was the valide sultan, the queen mother, whose word could move armies and whose glance could end a life. But power, like fire, devours what it touches. And when a mother rules from the shadows, the first to burn is often her own child. Tonight's story belongs to Kusum Sultan, once the most feared woman in the empire, and to the daughter who inherited both her beauty and her curse. Kusum Sultan had risen from a slave to an empress, from a concubine of Sultan Ahmed I to the regent of an empire that stretched across continents. For nearly half a century, she ruled behind curtains of silk, manipulating the sultans who were her sons, guiding armies, arranging marriages, and deciding who would live or die within the palace walls. Her face was rarely seen in public, yet her name carried the weight of thunder. People called her the mother of the empire. But within the palace, another name followed her in whispers, the Shadow Queen. For wherever her power reached, light disappeared. Her youngest surviving daughter, Kaya Sultan, was born into this world of trembling reverence and unseen terror. From her earliest days, Kaya knew her mother's love was not gentle. It was cold, fierce, shaped by fear of losing control. Kusum had watched too many of her children murdered in the name of politics, and she swore it would never happen again. So she raised Kaya not as a daughter, but as a weapon, a piece on the imperial chessboard to be moved with precision. Kaya's education was unmatched. She spoke 5 languages, wrote poetry, and studied governance beside the viziers. She had her mother's eyes, her father's patience, and a quiet defiance that neither court etiquette nor ritual could extinguish. When she came of age, Kusum arranged her marriage to Mehmed Pasha, a nobleman loyal to the dynasty. It was a political union, forged not for love, but for strategy. Yet in those early years, something unusual happened. Against all expectation, Kaya and her husband found affection. They built a life of laughter, rare for palace marriages, and their quarters were filled with music and poetry. Their daughter, born beneath the winter moon, was named Esma, a symbol of purity in a world that had long forgotten it. For a brief time, it seemed that happiness had found its way even into the empire's most gilded prison. But peace was a luxury the empire could not afford. When the Sultan's health began to fail, the question of succession ignited chaos within the court. Factions formed, alliances shifted, and the invisible war of the harem resumed. Kushem, fearing the rise of rival bloodlines, began to tighten her control. She summoned Kaya and demanded that her daughter abandon her husband and return to the palace, where she could be watched more closely. Kaya refused. Her defiance was calm, but final. "Mother," she said, "if you taught me to be strong, do not now ask me to be silent." Those words, though spoken softly, shattered the fragile bond between them. The Valide Sultan, enraged, but too calculating for open conflict, began to weave her web in silence. She spread rumors that Mehmed Pasha was conspiring with foreign ambassadors, that Kaya's affection had blinded her loyalty. Within weeks, the court whispered of treason. Mehmed was arrested, interrogated, and sent to command a doomed expedition far from Istanbul. He never returned. The official records say he died in battle. The truth is lost to time, though many believe Kösem herself signed the order. When the news reached Kaya, she did not scream or faint. She merely turned away from her mother and never spoke to her again. Years passed. Kaya raised her daughter in quiet exile within a corner of the palace, surrounded by servants who pitied her, but dared not help. Kösem continued to rule, first through her sons, then through her grandsons, until her power consumed even the family it was meant to protect. But no empire lasts forever. In the year 1651, a coup erupted inside Topkapi. The soldiers who once swore loyalty to the Valide Sultan turned against her. In the chaos, she was strangled by her own attendants, a death both swift and merciless. When Kaya heard the news, she neither wept nor rejoiced. She simply closed her door and ordered every mirror in her chamber covered. What remained of Kaya's life was a slow descent into memory. She refused to return to politics, choosing instead to care for her daughter and the children of the court whose mothers had perished. She became known as the Quiet Mother, a title that carried both respect and sorrow. Yet the empire did not forget her defiance. Every year, on the anniversary of Kösem's death, guards were stationed outside Kaya's quarters, as if fearing the dead queen's daughter might summon her mother's spirit. Some nights, attendants claimed to hear her speaking softly to the shadows. "Herr Torner gentle?" Her words impossible to catch. "You wanted an empire," she once whispered, "and I only wanted peace." Her story might have ended there, a quiet epilogue to her mother's reign. But fate is not kind to women born of power. When her daughter Esma came of age, history repeated itself. The new Valide Sultan, desiring to strengthen her influence, demanded that Esma be married to a powerful vizier. Kaya tried to protect her child, pleading with the court, but her voice carried no weight. Esma was sent away to a distant province, and within a year, the word came of her death, an illness, they said, though the details were vague. That night, the witnesses saw a single light burning in Kaya's room until dawn. When the servants entered in the morning, they found her sitting by the window, motionless. In her lap lay one of her mother's old letters. Its ink faded, but legible. It read, "To rule is to be alone." Kaya was buried beside her husband, far from the imperial tombs of her ancestors. No grand ceremony marked her passing. Yet, in a strange way, her silence became her triumph. A century later, when the archives of the Ottoman court were examined, scholars found hundreds of documents signed by sultans, viziers, and generals, but none bearing her name. It was as though history itself had bowed before her wish to disappear. She had refused to be a pawn in her mother's game, and by vanishing from record, she denied the empire the satisfaction of rewriting her. And so, in the long history of power, she became the ghost of restraint, a reminder that even within the heart of tyranny, a whisper of dignity can survive. Kozum's rule was remembered for its brilliance and its blood. Kaya's legacy was quieter, like the still water that reflects the stars after the storm has passed. The mother ruled in shadows, the daughter paid the price. But between them lies the eternal question of every empire. What is the cost of survival? And who must be sacrificed so the throne can stand? Perhaps that is why, even now, visitors who wander the corridors of Topkapi claim to feel a strange chill near the old women's quarters. They say that sometimes, just before dawn, the air thickens with the scent of burnt jasmine, and a faint voice whispers through the silence, not of anger, but of mourning. Some hear the words, "The empire is mine, no more." Others say it sounds like a lullaby, a mother singing to the daughter she could never save. As you listen to this tale, my friend, is remember that history often remembers the loudest voices, the conquerors, the kings, for the generals. But the truest stories lie in the quiet places, in the women who dared to feel in a world that punished emotion. Their tears built the same walls that held them captive, and their strength is the reason those walls still stand today. Now let the night settle deeper. The torches have gone out, and only the moon remains to guide us. In the next chapter, we will step beyond the palace and into the city itself, where the common people whispered tales of the royal women they never saw, imagining them as goddesses or ghosts. There, in the streets of Istanbul, myth and memory became one, and the empire's silence turned into legend. Good evening again, my friend. The night has deepened, and the sound of the city has softened into a hum, a low, ancient rhythm that belongs to Istanbul alone. The Bosphorus glimmers like a black mirror beneath the moon, and the domes of the mosques gleam faintly in the distance, their silhouettes rising like prayers frozen in time. Tonight, we leave the palace walls behind. The marble corridors and silk chambers are far away now. Instead, we walk through the streets where people once whispered about the women of Topkapi, the princesses they never saw, the queens they imagined, the ghosts who wore silk and sang to the sea. Because even when the empire silenced its daughters, the city found ways to remember them. And in the songs of the fishermen, in the poems of the coffee houses, in the lullabies sung by mothers to their children, the royal women lived again, changed into legend. In the 17th century, Istanbul was not only a city of power, but of sound. Every street had its rhythm, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the echo of traders calling in the markets, the chanting of the imams at dawn. But there was another sound, softer, carried on the wind at night, the songs of the storytellers. They were men and women who moved from square to square, weaving tales for coins or bread, their voices blending truth and invention until no one could tell the difference. The stories of the sultans and viziers were known to all, but what fascinated the people most were the tales of the women who lived behind the walls of the harem. They were seen as creatures of mystery, half divine, half cursed, and among those unseen faces, one name returned again and again: Fatma Sultan, the princess whose scream once echoed through Topkapi like thunder. Over time, her tragedy became myth. The storytellers no longer spoke of rituals or politics, they spoke of ghosts. They said that on moonless nights, a woman in white walked the palace terraces, her face veiled, her hands stained with ink instead of blood. They said she whispered to the stars, calling the names of her lost sisters, and that when the wind answered, the sea itself trembled. Some claimed she appeared to sailors near the old harbour, warning them of storms, while others believed she wandered the city disguised as a beggar, collecting tears to fill the Bosphorus. To the poor and forgotten, she became a symbol, a saint of sorrow, a spirit who understood pain too well. They left offerings of rose petals and small mirrors along the palace walls, believing that her soul listened from within. But myths are living things. My friend, they shift and adapt to the needs of those who tell them. By the 18th century, new names had joined Fatmas in the city's secret hymns, Alia. The princess of the Forbidden Garden, Kaya, the daughter who refused to kneel, and even Kosem, the Shadow Queen herself, now remembered not as a tyrant, but as a woman cursed by ambition. The city turned their pain into poetry, their silence into song. In the narrow alleys of Galata and the courtyards of Üsküdar, musicians sang ballads of the rose that bloomed behind stone walls, and the mother who ruled the night. Fishermen swore that the early morning mist rising from the Bosphorus was not fog at all, but the sighs of the harem's restless souls escaping before sunrise. There was one song, known to this day, called The Wind of Alia. No one knows who composed it. Its melody drifts between sadness and sweetness, and its words tell of a woman who loved a man she was forbidden to see. The rose spoke to the wind, the lyrics say, and the wind carried her scent across the water. Every singer added their own verse. Every generation changed the ending. In some versions, Alia's spirit found her lover in the afterlife. In others, she turned into the breeze itself, touching the faces of those who dared to dream. And so the people of Istanbul began to believe that love, even when crushed by empire, could still survive through air, through sound, through song. At night, when the palace was asleep, the city beneath it breathed. Lanterns glowed in the coffee houses where scholars debated and poets recited verses that skirted the edge of blasphemy. Between the smoke of hookahs and the fragrance of cardamom, men whispered about the women who ruled without being seen. Some claimed that the empire itself endured only because of them, that every victory, every treaty, every act of mercy was guided by invisible hands behind the curtains of the harem. Others warned that those same hands had dragged countless men to ruin. Beware the silk shadow, they said. It is softer than air and sharper than justice. In their fear, they gave power to the legends they had invented. In their reverence, they gave those women immortality. And yet, beneath all the superstition and song, there was truth. The women of the harem were no longer just prisoners. The centuries had changed them. Some had become scholars, collectors of art, patrons of architecture and literature. They built mosques, funded schools, and secretly sponsored poets who dared to write about freedom. One such poet, a woman named Leyla Hanım, wrote under the name The Unseen Star. She was said to be a descendant of the palace attendants and grew up hearing the forbidden stories whispered in her grandmother's kitchen. Her poems carried the echo of those voices. The empire built its beauty from our silence. She wrote, "But silence is a seed. One day, it will bloom again." Her verses spread like wildfire through the city, copied by hand, memorized, sung softly by women at their looms, until even the men who banned them began to quote her unknowingly. By the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire began to fade, the line between myth and memory blurred completely. Western travelers arrived in Istanbul with notebooks and curiosity, hungry for tales of exotic queens and mysterious harems. They filled their diaries with fantasies, never realizing that their guides were repeating the same old stories the city had been telling itself for centuries. One French artist painted The Princess of Mirrors, a vision of Fatma Sultan seated before an endless reflection, her eyes filled with sorrow. Another wrote an opera about the silent bride. Inspired by the rituals once practiced in the palace, they thought they were inventing art. But in truth, they were echoing the whispers of the Bosphorus, the same voice that had haunted the city since the 17th century. Even today, if you walk along the seawalls of Topkapi at dusk, the air feels different. The tourists take their photographs, unaware of the invisible audience that watches them from time itself. The gulls circle above, crying in tones that sound almost human. And the wind carries the faintest notes of an ancient melody, the one the fishermen still hum when the waves rise too high. It is not superstition. It is remembrance. The walls of the palace, the stones of the mosques, the wooden beams of the old houses, all have absorbed the sound of the women who once breathed there. You cannot see them, but you can feel their presence like warmth beneath the skin. They are part of the city now, its invisible heartbeat. One night, long ago, a traveller from Persia wrote in his journal that he had stayed near the palace gardens and heard singing at midnight. He described it as the softest voice, neither human nor angelic, repeating a single line over and over, "I am still here." He thought it a dream, until the following morning when he walked by the same wall and found a single white rose growing through the cracks of the stone. He picked it, pressed it into his book, and kept it until his death. The rose turned black with time, but the scent, he said, never faded. Perhaps, my friend, that is what legacy truly is: not marble, not crowns, not the brittle pages of history, but scent, sound, and memory. The empire fell. Its palaces turned to museums, its rulers to portraits. Yet the songs of the city remain. They remind us that every whisper, every tear, every act of quiet defiance leaves a trace, too small for the eye but too deep for time to erase. The ghosts who wore silk are not haunting us out of vengeance. They are watching to see if we remember. So, as the night grows still, and the sound of the Bosphorus fills the silence between breaths, listen closely. The city is singing again, just as it did 400 years ago. The melodies are different. The language has changed, but the soul remains the same. It is the same pulse that once moved through Fatma, through Alia, through Kaya and Kosum, the rhythm of survival disguised as beauty. The songs of the city have become their afterlife. Rest now, my friend, but keep your heart open to the echoes. In the next chapter, we will return once more to the palace, not to its splendor, but to its end. We will stand in the final years of the empire, when the last princess looked out from her balcony and saw the flag of the sultans fall. And as she watched history collapse beneath her feet, she whispered a final prayer for the women who came before her. Hiểu rồi, bạn muốn part 8 viết lại nghiêm túc. Văn cao cấp. Cảm xúc sâu. Cinematic. It. Good evening. Mở đầu kiểu lập. Mang hơi hướng bedtime story. Kết hợp phim tài liệu lịch sử. Ngôn ngữ Mỹ tự nhiên nhưng sang trọng. Nhịp chậm mà nặng. Không xến. Không lặp lại mô, tiếp cũ. Tôi sẽ viết lại hoàn toàn phần 8. Vẫn giữ nội dung về Selma Sultan, The Last Princess, nhưng theo phong cách bình thường, chân thực, tinh tế, như giọng kể phim The Last Empress của Netflix hoặc BBC Royal Tragedies, từng câu như dòng hồi ức trôi qua màn sương. Part 8, The Last Princess, and the empire that forgot her. The empire was dying long before anyone dared to speak its name. Its palaces still glittered, its servants still bowed, and the call to prayer still rolled across the Bosphorus like a heartbeat, too proud to stop. Yet beneath the marble floors of Topkapi, time had already begun to rot. The sultans continued their rituals. the viziers, their ceremonies. But the rhythm had slowed. The gold was fading to dust. And among the last children born inside those fading walls was a girl named Selma Sultan, a princess of a world that no longer existed by the time she learned to walk. She grew up surrounded by relics that pretended to be alive. The harem still held its strict rules, though its power had long drained away. Eunuchs whispered the old commands as if the words themselves might keep the walls from collapsing. The women still wore pearls, but they no longer sparkled. Their laughter had turned brittle, a habit more than a feeling. In the courtyards, the fountains no longer sang. They gurgled quietly under layers of moss. It was an empire pretending not to notice its own funeral. And yet, in the center of it all, Selma was alive in a way the others weren't. Her tutors found her difficult. She would question the verses she was told to memorize. She wanted to read French novels, not royal decrees. She drew maps of places she would never be allowed to see: Vienna, Cairo, London. A princess, they told her, belongs to history. And she would answer, then history must belong to me too. The older women shook their heads and called her restless. The younger ones called her brave. But even bravery had no place left to go. By the time she reached womanhood, the empire outside her window was bleeding. The soldiers were coming home in fragments. The ships that once carried tribute now carried debt. The sultan still held court, but he ruled over nothing but memory. Selma could hear it in the silence between the ceremonies. The end was near. She began to write at night, her candle hidden behind the lattice window, recording everything she saw with the detachment of someone already living beyond it. Power, she wrote, is a dream that begins with devotion and ends with apology. Her diary would one day be found, its pages yellowed, her handwriting steady, even as her world fell apart. Then came the war that erased everything. Foreign soldiers entered Istanbul. Their flags rose above the mosques. Their laughter echoed in the streets. Topkapi Palace, the symbol of 600 years of dominion, became a cage filled with ghosts. The Sultan hid behind closed doors. The court ladies cried in silence. The corridors smelled of damp silk and fear. Selma walked among them like someone wandering through a mausoleum. She was not afraid. She was fascinated. They are burying the empire while it is still breathing. She wrote, and we are the mourners pretending to be alive. When the new republic finally came, the order arrived like a knife in an envelope. The Ottoman dynasty was abolished. The royal family was stripped of titles, their lands seized, their names forbidden. The sultans, their wives, their children all were exiled from the soil that had once worshipped their footsteps. In a single night, the empire's bloodline was erased. The women packed what little they could carry: pearls, prayer books, and the ghosts of their ancestors, and waited for ships that would take them to nowhere. Selma walked through the empty palace one last time. The corridors smelled of smoke from burnt records, and the echo of footsteps followed her like a farewell. She touched the cold marble pillars that had watched her ancestors rise and fall and whispered, "You will outlive us all." In the main hall, where sultans once ruled, she stood beneath the chandelier and looked up into the fractured mirrors. "I was born inside a story already ending," she said. No one answered. The walls no longer listened. She left Istanbul before dawn. The city she loved disappeared behind a veil of fog, its skyline melting into the horizon like ink in water. On the deck of the ship, she stood alone, her white veil fluttering in the salt wind. Someone asked her if she was afraid. "No," she said. "Fear belongs to those who still have something to lose." Exile carried her first to France, where she lived among aristocrats who pitied her as a curiosity from the East. Then to Egypt, where the remnants of her family scattered like forgotten pearls. Finally, to India, where the last Ottoman princess rented a small room by the sea and taught languages to children who did not know her name. The newspapers would later call her the Forgotten Princess. But she was never forgotten by the sea. Every night, she would sit by the window and watch the waves move in rhythms that reminded her of the Bosphorus tides. The water doesn't care who rules it. She wrote, "It remembers everything and forgives nothing." Her later years were quiet, marked by poverty and peace. She no longer sought to be a symbol. The world had grown tired of empires, and the women they buried. Yet her letters written to friends who rarely replied revealed a calm kind of wisdom. Freedom, she once wrote, is not the absence of walls, but the refusal to build new ones inside yourself. When asked if she missed her homeland, she smiled faintly. "I miss the sound of footsteps in marble halls," she said, "and the scent of jasmine before dawn, but I do not miss being invisible." In the end, she lived as she had been born between two worlds, the East that had forgotten her, and the West that never understood her. She died in 1965, her heart giving out quietly one night as she wrote in her diary. On the last page were 3 lines. "The empire is gone. The silence remains. But silence, too, has a heartbeat." They buried her in a small cemetery near Paris, beside other exiles who had once ruled the world and then faded into history's margins. No royal procession followed. No anthem played. Only the sound of rain, falling softly over the graves of those who once commanded armies. But perhaps that was fitting. Her empire had begun with fire and ended with rain. Years later, when historians opened her notebooks, they found a single pressed rose between 2 pages dry, fragile, its color almost gone. Beneath it, she had written, "The rose did not survive the empire, but the scent stayed." That sentence became her epitaph, engraved on a stone no larger than a book. Visitors still come to see it. Some leave flowers, others only stand in silence. They do not mourn her. They listen because the quiet seems to hum with memory, as if the ghosts of the Ottoman daughters are still breathing somewhere in the wind. And maybe they are. The palace in Istanbul, now a museum filled with tourists and light, still trembles on certain nights when the wind rises from the sea. The guides dismiss it as the settling of old marble. But those who know the stories say otherwise. They say that when the chandeliers sway and the tapestries rustle, it is not the building that moves, it is the women returning, not in sorrow, not in vengeance, but in remembrance. Selma, Fatma, Alia, Kaya names, once erased from history, now written into the air itself. The empire forgot them, but the city never did. Every whisper of silk, every echo of laughter that drifts across the Bosphorus after dark carries their memory. They were born to obey, yet somehow they endured. The empire of men crumbled. The empire of silence survived. And Selma, the last of its queens, gave it voice not through power, but through remembrance. Because in the end, history belongs not to those who ruled, but to those who remember what ruling cost. History ends in silence, more often than it ends in fire. When the guns go quiet, when the banners are folded, when the palaces are turned into museums, what remains are not the rulers or their wars, but the echoes, the breaths between the words, the spaces where truth hides. The Ottoman Empire, with its centuries of glory and cruelty, did not collapse in one great scream, but faded, breath by breath, into the hush of its own exhaustion. Yet the silence it left behind was not empty. It was full of ghosts, not of kings, but of the women who had built its beauty, carried its secrets, and endured its weight. They are the ones still whispering through time. Their voices faint but unbroken. The unseen architects of a world that pretended not to hear them. In the archives of Istanbul, historians speak of a phenomenon they cannot fully explain. When they read the old letters of the royal women, the diaries of princesses, the confessions of handmaidens, they often pause, not for lack of understanding, but because the words seem to breathe. It is as if, within every line, something alive still moves. The empire wrote its history in the language of conquest, yet these women wrote in the language of endurance. Fatma Sultan's pain became poetry. Alia's forbidden love became wind. Kaya's silence became dignity, and Selma's exile became remembrance. Their stories, once erased, have reassembled themselves like fragments of a shattered mirror, finding their way back into shape. What remains is not a chronicle of tragedy, but an anatomy of survival. When you walk through Topkapi today, you can feel that survival in the air. The marble still holds warmth in places where sunlight never reaches. The gardens, once trimmed by slaves, now grow freely. The jasmine climbing without permission over the old stone walls. The sound of water in the fountains is softer now, like a lullaby, and if you stand long enough in the courtyard of the harem, you may notice how the wind changes direction, carrying a faint sweetness, the ghost of rose oil, perhaps, or simply the memory of 1,000 mornings where women stood waiting for a sky they would never touch. The empire is gone, but the atmosphere has memory. Buildings remember hands. Air remembers breath. Over the centuries, the world outside changed faster than the stones could forget. The Republic replaced the monarchy, but it could not erase the centuries that came before it. The modern city grew over the bones of the old one, steel over marble, asphalt over dust. But the soul of Istanbul never chose sides. It still belongs to both the living and the dead. The Bosphorus still gleams under the moon as it did when Fatma walked its terraces. The call to prayer still rises at dawn. The same sound that once reached the ears of Selma in exile. It is all still there, rewritten but not erased. The women of the empire, though gone, are everywhere. In the rhythm of waves, in the scent of rain on the palace walls, in the hush that follows the last note of the muezzin's voice. For 600 years, the Ottoman world demanded silence from its daughters. They were told that obedience was holy, that their voices were dangerous, that their love must be hidden behind veils. And yet, in the end, it was their silence that outlasted the empire. Not because they obeyed, but because they remembered. They turned silence into a language the empire could not control. It became the lull between heartbeats, the pause before a prayer, the breath before a scream. It became something vast enough to contain all the words they were forbidden to say. When the empire died, that silence did not die with it. It spread. It became a kind of truth, too quiet to destroy. In recent years, researchers have begun restoring the private writings of the imperial women, small journals found in trunks, notes hidden in the bindings of books, scraps of poetry embroidered into garments. One fragment, attributed to Princess Fatma's attendants, reads, "We were taught to lower our eyes, but even the ground remembers faces." Another, believed to be written by a handmaid of Alia's sultan, says simply, "If you must love in secret, then let the wind be your messenger." And in Selma's diary, her final entry is written as if to all of them across time. We were called silence, but we were only waiting for someone to listen. Each sentence is a pulse, proof that history is never entirely dead. The empire's daughters learned to survive in the smallest spaces in the width of a mirror's reflection, in the corner of a page, in the breath before dawn. They turned endurance into art. What their fathers built in marble, They built in memory. Outside the palace, beyond the tourist cameras and the sound of the city's traffic, the Bosphorus still keeps its secrets. Sailors still talk of voices at night, soft, distant, speaking in a tongue no one recognizes. Some say it is only the wind against the stone. Others swear they hear laughter. Quiet and knowing, old fishermen call them the women of the tide. Spirits who rise when the moon is high and the sea turns silver. They say these women walk on the surface of the water, veiled in mist, their gowns trailing like clouds. They carry lanterns shaped like crescent moons and sing not in grief but in defiance. And when the wind shifts, they vanish, leaving behind the scent of roses and the feeling that something sacred has just passed by. Perhaps these are only stories, but stories are what keep the dead alive. They are how memory refuses to be buried. Every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually becomes a story told by those who survived it. The Ottoman Empire, for all its grandeur, is now a whisper on the lips of poets, a flicker in the dreams of historians. But its women, its Fatmas and Alias and Selmas remain. They exist not as rulers or martyrs, but as reminders that strength often wears the face of endurance. They teach us that silence is not always submission, that even when the world denies you voice, your existence still speaks. And so the empire of silence continues. It lives in every woman who chooses to speak softly, but stand firmly. It lives in every act of patience, mistaken for weakness. It lives in every daughter who learns from the quiet resilience of her mothers. The women of the Ottoman dynasty may have been bound by marble and silk, but their legacy is boundless. They turned captivity into memory, memory into myth, and myth into truth. Now, century later, the last princess sleeps beneath foreign soil. The empire, a ghost upon the map. But her story still stirs in the wind that moves across the Bosphorus, in the shimmer of dawn over the domes, in the murmur of a language older than power. You can almost hear it if you stand still enough, the faint rhythm of 1,000 voices breathing as one. Not a prayer, not a cry, just a single, eternal whisper. We are still here,